Who was Richard Ramirez? The chilling legacy of the Night Stalker. The sound of heavy footsteps echoes across the silent streets of Los Angeles. A shadow moves past a bedroom window, and within moments, another person falls victim to a violent intruder. Between the spring and summer of 1985, an entire state was gripped by an almost primal fear. The nocturnal predator would later be known as Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker. To some, he was a monster born of tragic circumstances. To others, he was pure evil, a man who deliberately embraced darkness and left an everlasting legacy of terror. So, who was Richard Ramirez? How did an unassuming child from El Paso, Texas, transform into one of America's most terrifying predators? This video delves into Ramirez's troubled past, the psychotic spree that captivated an entire nation, the chilling satanic symbolism defining his murders, and the relentless pursuit that finally ended his reign of terror. Stick around as we profile the twisted mind of the Night Stalker, a man whose crimes defied categorization, leaving an indelible scar on the collective psyche of an entire generation. Before he became synonymous with fear, Richard Ramirez was simply a young boy growing up in the dusty town of El Paso, Texas. Born on February 29, 1960, the youngest of 5 children, his early years were marked by instability. By all accounts, his childhood was anything but normal. Richard developed epilepsy at a young age, a condition that isolated him socially and physically. His family life only added to the emotional chaos. His father, a disciplinarian with a violent streak, subjected the children to physical abuse that left visible and lasting marks. Meanwhile, Richard's older cousin, Miguel, proved to be a far deadlier influence. Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran, regaled a young Richard with gruesome stories of violence from the battlefield, even showing Polaroids of tortured and mutilated victims. To an impressionable teenage boy already plagued by inner turmoil, these tales planted the seeds for an unhealthy fascination with death and brutality. As Richard grew older, he turned to substance abuse. Drugs became an escape from the harsh realities of his life, a place where he could wrestle with his demons, albeit briefly. He began rebelling against authority, skipping school, and committing petty crimes. But the most disturbing shift? His burgeoning obsession with Satanism, fueled by Miguel and his own warped interpretations of power and control. It wasn't long before Richard Ramiro's curiosity about the macabre spiraled into something far darker. His interest in Satanism was no longer idle intrigue, but a defining feature of his identity. The inverted pentagram, chants, and rituals became a dark creed he carried into every facet of his life. This belief system wasn't just an accessory, it was a hallmark of his crimes. Ramirez didn't simply murder, he reveled in the chaos, decorating his crime scenes with satanic symbols and messages. Forensics teams would find pentagrams scrawled on walls and in blood, reinforcing the terror he was sowing. His philosophy was deeply twisted. By aligning himself with Satan, Ramirez felt untouchable, an instrument of ultimate power. At this point, his juvenile delinquency gave way to more serious, calculated acts of violence. In 1984, he committed his first known murder, Mei Leung, a 9-year-old girl brutally assaulted in the basement of her apartment building. It was a crime that offered no clear motive other than cruelty. From there, the killings escalated in both frequency and brutality. By early 1985, Richard Ramirez's reign of terror was in full swing. From February to August of that year, his crimes would horrify California residents and leave law enforcement baffled. Ramirez's modus operandi was as erratic as it was horrifying, targeting men, women, and children alike. There was no discernible victim profile. He struck indiscriminately, attacking victims of varying ages, ethnicities, and social standings. His signature approach involved breaking into homes during the dead of night, selected seemingly at random. Once inside, Ramirez unleashed his sadistic tendencies, acts of physical assault, rape, and murder. Some victims, like Vincent and Maxine Zazara, were subjected to horrifying mutilation post-mortem, adding to the shock and outrage when their bodies were discovered. In several cases, he left survivors behind to spread the story of their horrific encounters. These survivors painted a chilling portrait of a man who seemed to enjoy the terror he inflicted. Adding to the victim's trauma, the vicious killer left satanic symbols behind as a grim reminder of his ideology. Police were baffled as patterns in his crimes remained unclear. The randomness added to the fear, as it seemed no one could predict where or when the Night Stalker would strike next. Law enforcement faced an enormous challenge in trying to apprehend Ramirez. For months, there was no single pattern linking the murders beyond their brutality. He used a variety of weapons: guns, knives, bludgeons, and his entry methods were equally diverse. Breaking windows, sneaking through open doors, picking locks, it all made profiling him a monumental task. The scattered, unpredictable nature of the attacks threw investigators off track for weeks. At one point, he struck in both Los Angeles and San Francisco within days, further complicating the jurisdictional lines. Public panic soared as media outlets began dubbing Ramirez the Night Stalker. With sketchy witness descriptions circulating, Angelenos prepared for the worst. They installed extra locks, boarded windows, and kept weapons close by. The city was paralyzed by terror. Life effectively halted under the weight of fear. But the turning point would come from unexpected sources: a partial fingerprint found at a crime scene and an attempt at stealing a car. These breadcrumbs slowly began to unveil the Night Stalker's true identity. By August 1985, Ramirez's days on the run were nearing an end. A breakthrough came when a partial print from one of the crime scenes matched a suspect in police records. Additionally, witness accounts began closing in on his identity, sparking a public awareness campaign. The final chapter of his capture played out like an ironic justice. While attempting to elude arrest, Ramirez entered a neighborhood only to find that his face had been plastered across every television screen and newspaper. Recognized by vigilant residents, he was chased through the streets and eventually held down until law enforcement arrived. For the first time in months, Los Angeles breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Night Stalker had been caught. The trial of Richard Ramirez was one of the most high-profile in U.S. history, attracting national and international attention. Ramirez's court appearances were as shocking as his crimes. He flashed pentagrams carved into his hands, threatened jurors, and even declared "Hail Satan" during proceedings. In 1989, after a trial lasting several years and involving overwhelming evidence, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and placed on death row, a sentence he remained under until his death from cancer in 2013. The trial left the public grappling with one lingering question: was Richard Ramirez a product of his circumstances, or was he evil incarnate? Psychologists and criminologists have long debated what drove Richard Ramirez down such a dark path. His abusive childhood, head injuries, and exposure to violence through his cousin Miguel could explain the origins of his trauma. Others argue that his choices as an adult, immersing himself in drugs and Satanism, embracing brutality, were clear indications of deliberate evil. His crimes revealed a mind devoid of empathy, thriving on suffering and terror. Ramirez himself never showed remorse, immersing himself fully in his self-styled image as a servant of Satan. This deliberate disconnect from humanity remains one of the most chilling aspects of his profile. Richard Ramirez's horrifying rampage remains seared in the memory of those who lived through it. The Night Stalker's reign of terror permanently altered the way people thought about safety, particularly the concept of being safe within one's home. Neighborhood vigilance increased across the nation, with alarm systems and bolted doors becoming standard precautions. Beyond the immediately palpable fear, Ramirez's crimes cemented an enduring fascination with true crime. His story is continually dissected in books, documentaries, and podcasts, offering a chilling reflection of the societal allure to understand the incomprehensible. As we examined Richard Ramirez's life and crimes, one solemn truth emerges: monsters aren't always born in shadows. Sometimes they're molded in plain sight, step by step, until their darkness consumes others, and ultimately, themselves. What do you think? Was Ramirez a consequence of nurture and circumstance, or did he choose the path of evil willingly? Let us know in the comments below, and stay safe, true crime fans. The world is both darker and stranger than it seems.